discussion, I'll sort of seed it with saying how much neural inspiration, how much biological fidelity do we need? Again, I mean, most of the talks today had more of a algorithmic and neuroscience. Actually, Sebastian, do you want to come on in? For yeah. So actually, again, maybe then binding the or bounding the problem a little bit more, saying somebody mentioned earlier today. Actually, we'll probably touch up on it tomorrow too. For two purposes: one, trying to understand the brain; two, for trying to build systems to control natural systems or engineered systems. Again, depending on what we're trying to do, there might be different levels of complexity or detail that we wanted to dig into. But I just wanted to get, based on today's discussion, just maybe starting and then evolving from there.
The coolest argument I heard for getting really a whole lot of detail is Sebastian's Nature paper that he presented today, where you need to know exactly where the dendrites are to even have a chance of getting the right motion detection account. That matters for neuroscience. It might not matter at all for AI or for neuromorphic engineering. I'm curious what Sebastian thinks. I mean, there are a whole lot of algorithms people have proposed over the years for that particular problem, and knowing this detail gives us the right account for how the brain does. I'm not sure it matters if you're just building an AI system.
Yeah, so the data I talked about I think is critical for understanding how the retina computes motion. The criticism would be that we already know how to compute the direction of motion, so it doesn't really help to study how the retina does it, right? So, but I think that if you want to take biological inspiration, you've got to take an approach that will actually help you figure out how the brain works. Otherwise, you might as well just forget about it. Just do AI. So either you make the commitment and you try to figure out how the brain does it, or just don't waste any time doing it. So yeah.
What the goal is. So maybe
No. I'm saying even for AI, you got to decide: is it really going to help to understand how the brain does it, or not? Right? Yeah.
What is the best argument coming out of your data, if any, that someone doing pure AI should care about? There's 5 different ways you can do motion detection, and why not? If I'm an engineer, just pick one at random. Why do I care which one the brain does?
Well, I think what I showed today, I don't think anyone would be interested from the engineering viewpoint, but there's all the circuitry that we haven't uncovered that might actually be interesting from the engineering viewpoint.
Well, here's another stab at it, which is saying that the brain solves a huge number of different problems, and depending on your perspective, using a fairly homogeneous hardware substrate, right? And when AI tries to tackle those problems, they use all different kinds of algorithms. And so, there is something quite compelling about the fact that, this one thing that learns to solve all these different problems using the same kind of hardware, there's some kind of magic there. And I think that's the kind of thing that a lot of us look at and say, gee, I wish I understood how that thing solves those kinds of problems using this one magic algorithm, and what the hell is it, right? And so yeah, and this is a general issue that I've seen across the field, is that if you want to solve a particular problem, often you're much better off doing an engineering AI-based solution. You say, okay, look, I'm solving this particular problem, here's the things, here's the equations, boom. But then, this is the kind of point about backprop. It's the second best solution to every single problem, right? It's a general purpose solution. And a lot of times you don't want to spend all that time engineering some particular problem, and so there's different trade-offs there. So I think if you somebody handed you this thing that could just tell it what to do and it'll do it, and give it a few examples and train it up, and there it goes. AI people would be pretty damn excited about that thing, right? And so that's the argument I see, is that we haven't yet in the AI sphere created anything that matches that general purpose nature of true human intelligence.
And one thing that I think is really important in looking at the biology is distinguishing what is important about the algorithm versus what are just biological constraints. And we have no idea which ones those are. So I mean, I think that if we're going to figure out what we need to extract from the brain, we need to be able to disentangle those. And we can do it maybe by trying stuff and maybe putting in constraints and loosening constraints. But I think that's an important question that we need to answer.
I mean, now I'll argue for Sebastian's result. I mean, there's a general question of what level of detail we need to model the brain and if we want to have an accurate brain simulation. And his data clearly bear on that. So, I mean, do you need a point model? Do you need to know where the dendrites are? So if you don't care about AI per se, but you care about neuroscience, then you certainly need to get some data at that level in order to say, where do we start? What are the sampling units that we're going to use? And I see your data as very relevant to that and very interesting to that.
Can I say something? Yeah. So I think Sebastian's data is beautiful, but it hasn't really have an impact on AI, like just for that particular cell type. But I think like learning more deeply about the biological systems, whether you need to know this, how detailed you learn about the circuit, I think it will have an impact on AI. For example, I really enjoy reading like Marcus Meister's paper on the retina. And I think there is a lot of the assumption of neural network is basically violated in the retina. And I think like using those ideas of like what Marcus Meister found could potentially will change the paradigm, even in neural network. You just have people haven't actually put that into use. And like Jacob was asking Ellen a question, right? What is the difficulty with the compositional machine? And one of the difficulties is it's much more difficult to train than like a normal deep network. And we actually understand like how the basic principles underlying this kind of compositional learning. And I do believe that kind of compositional learning happen at every level, right? So if you look really in detail in V1, like what he proposed in the Micron project, even I may not apply for it, I think it will, like knowing all this circuitry is going to have an impact for figuring out the detailed computation. For example, I was advocating the top-down approach, right? Coming from computer vision, knowing what works and what doesn't work. And if that kind of top-down approach can meet the constraint of the anatomical data, then I think it will provide some insight to the actual algorithms that like how predictive coding can be happening, how like this sparse coding and associative learning can be happening. So those three circuits I was proposing is only like what we know, like as a small glimpse of the actual powerful machinery in the brain. And now I'm kind of very interested to actually see, for example, whether the PV neuron is implementing the sparse coding, whether the SOM neuron, the somatostatin neurons, like in the mouse. There's a tremendous amount of information that is coming out from the mouse study in the last 10 years. And just looking at those circuits, I can immediately see the connections like with the computational circuits I was thinking of. And it may not be true, but at least I think it will kind of, but I think understanding a little things about the neuroscience will have a great impact. Like Laplacian pyramid is an example, like, and Gabor wavelet is another example. Just a tiny little thing we learn about the brain will have a huge impact. I mean, all the neural network is just Macaulay and Pitt, right? And perceptron, and now see what they can do. So imagine what we actually understand the complicated machinery, like just in a small column.
Someone else eager to go.
So just to echo that, I think the key is inspiration. And it's very hard to get inspiration from neuroscience if you don't understand something about the neuroscience. And so if you look at, something like the, direction selective Hamilton cells, that may not itself be useful for an algorithm directly, but it gives us a kind of insight that is useful for inspiration. In fact, my instinct is very few actual neural mechanisms that the specific details of which we observe in the neuroscience side are going to be directly translatable to an application. You're going to turn that into some abstracted algorithm that's going to be more computationally efficient, probably more effective along the dimensions we care about from an engineering point of view. But you would never get to that point if you didn't zoom back out and look at what have some understanding of what the biological system was to begin with. And so that's why I think this sort of kind of insight into the computational neuroscience of these systems is incredibly important. Otherwise, we're just coming up with algorithms and justifying with some neural implementation, which of course you can always find. There's always a way to make neurons do something. That's the Bartlett-Mell quote we just heard about. So you really need to, I think the bottom-up approach is very valuable to constrain our search in a way.
Here, I'll take this. I mean, just as a thought experiment, because I'll rephrase it. What was implicit in the last two comments is this whole dichotomy between bottom-up and top-down, or dichotomy is not the right word, tension between bottom-up and top-down. And I think my view as a cognitive scientist from the outside is that most of what gets funding in neuroscience is bottom-up stuff. And that so far the bottom-up stuff hasn't had that much impact in machine learning. Somebody had a nice figure of that earlier today, maybe it was you. And I think it's an interesting kind of thought experiment to try to figure out what are the cases where we could only find something bottom-up, or where the bottom-up doesn't map on to the top-down thing that was independently proposed. So in the case of motion detection, there was lots of top-down reason to expect that there would be some kind of algorithm. And you get some additional detail when you do the bottom-up thing. The most interesting case would be if you came up with some notion bottom-up that didn't really map onto any of the tools that, say, cognitive science already had. I think that would be the exciting case, and I don't have a feel for whether we'll find any. I don't know one offhand. Maybe someone in the room does. I think it'd be interesting. I'd like to see more top-down stuff. So, like, I think Alan's stuff is very interesting, but people don't work as much in that way in neuroscience because they're sort of like, well, I know how to look whether there's an analog to deep nets in what I'm doing. And so Jim DiCarlo's doing that kind of stuff. And people don't quite know how to find the bottom-up support or disconfirmation for Alan's stuff. And I wish there was a bit more work in that direction.
I would echo that, and I would say that actually we can use the bottom-up stuff as a substitute for having really good information level descriptions of what the networks are doing. So if we could functionally record from all the neurons, as Jeremy will talk about tomorrow, and we could do that for long enough and we have enough experiments, then I would say that the information encoding for these populations of neurons is the thing that we should be looking at. And that the mechanism, we might need the mechanism as a substitute for inadequate experiments, even if we can record all of them.
Audience questions? Or?
Absolutely, you want to know how that information, so Sebastian said, what about the Jennifer Aniston neuron? And that you know the encoding, but you don't know how it got there. But you want to know how it got there so that you can generalize. But I think you want to know how it got there from an informational point of view.
What does that mean? What does that mean? I don't understand what that means.
This is like the 4-color problem. We have 3 microphones and like 7 or 8 people.
No, as an ex-physicist, I think, in physics, it was well, I'm not sure, tension or thing between phenomenologists, physicists who were sort of building up from experiments, and then people who were imposing structures. I guess one could argue that the last 40 years, string theory has been an example of a top-down approach that may not have worked very well, but in their defense, there wasn't very much bottom-up data. But I think, I'd say that in physics, there's been, generally, apart from a few exceptions, there's been a healthy tension between work that's sort of growing from the bottom up, from the experimental detail, and then people trying to make sort of bigger conjectures or things. So I would argue for both top-down and
Well, and what
bottom-up.
we really want are bridges, right? And let's not forget that. What we really want are bridges between these different levels of explanation.
I'll take an objection to the last comment here. We have so much bottoms-up data. When anyone tells me we need more, you just have no idea how much unassimilated data there is in neuroscience. And it's nice to have more stuff. It would be nice to record. But it's not true that there hasn't been a lot of, there's so much unassimilated data you can spend your life trying to swim through it. And I don't think we have a problem of needing more bottom-up data. I think we have a problem that people haven't been paying attention to the data we have. It's very inaccessible. It's very difficult to read. If you're not a neuroscientist, papers are very hard to translate. So most people just don't read it. and they don't know it. But I'll take an objection to the fact that, we need more data. There's so much.
I usually argue against data, but I will point out, or against like blind devotion to data, but I will point out that there's a lot of data that I think is at the wrong grain level, which is all this fMRI data, which was way too assiduously collected.
I wouldn't disagree with that, but you can take out all the fMRI data and go back, go look at just the anatomy and physiology data. Just look at the anatomy data we have already. It's incredible. You were talking earlier about someone was talking about the thalamus. I'm sorry. It is a very complex structure. There are thousands of papers, or hundreds at least papers written about the details of how that structure works, what the relay cells act like, what are their different modes of operation, what are the connectivity to them, where they are on the dendrites. This stuff is there. Now, you can argue that it's not important. Maybe you can say, I don't care about that.
But if we have so much, how come we can't say we understand how the brain works?
Because I think most people don't look at it.
No, the question is, if you're saying that all the data is there, we're just...
I didn't say all the data there. I said there's so much unassimilated data.
I really completely disagree with the viewpoint you're expressing.
Well, you disagree that there's a lot of data. Just take the thalamus.
There's a lot of data, and some of it we can't believe.
Well, wait. So you're dismissing the data.
There's a lot of that we can't believe, and there's a lot of data that's missing.
But have you taken the effort to learn that data? Have you taken the effort to read those papers, or are you just dismissing them out of hand?
So let's just give you an example. Retinal direction selection.
I don't know retinal. I can't talk about that.
No, let me give you an example.
I can talk about the things I know.
The retina presumably is simpler than the cortex.
No, I would disagree with that completely. The retina has been under a lot more evolutionary pressure than the neocortex. It was a misstatement, I think, he said earlier. The neocortex got large very, very quickly in evolutionary time. We've had retinal-like structures far longer. So that is a structure that's been under much longer evolutionary pressure than neocortex. And we got a big neocortex basically by replicating structure. There was not even enough time in the evolution of large neocortex to give it much evolutionary pressure. So I think that's an assumption on your part, but I think it's not a commonly held assumption. But anyway, I don't know the retina. I'm not saying more data isn't helpful. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that when it comes to structures like the neocortex and the thalamus and the basal ganglia, those structures have huge amounts of data, and it may take a little difficulty to wade through it, and some of it's contradictory, and you have to figure that out. But I just argue that people pay no attention to it.
And just to second that, I think that there's a huge amount of data out there, and I think what's lacking is, from the theoretical side, going back to the physics analogy, is clearly defined tests that distinguish between different theoretical frameworks.
Well, I agree with that too, and I think that's it's a combination of two things. One is not enough people are trying to do the theory on the real data. They do theory, we come out of theory, in this case comes out of people out of computer science and mathematics and whatever, and how many people really read, if you're going to talk about the thalamus, you're going to talk about something, have you read the papers? Have you really studied what we know about it before you say, well, I think I know what it's doing or what it's not doing or something like that. So I think we have a shortage of theory. Another problem is that in neuroscience, it has attracted and funding has actually restricted research or theoretical approaches for very long. And I've heard this out of numerous funding agencies and the whole process about how it goes about. So neuroscientists have been discouraged over the years from actually doing theoretical work. So that's another problem, which people have been trying to fix.
Here.
Yeah, it's a very well-known problem. You talk to people in the NIH and other places, and they'll tell you how it happened and why it's like that, and how grant proposals don't get approved if you have a theoretical component. People say they're trying to change that, but that has been historically the way it's been.
I think that's true in every field. Theoretical work in every single field, physics to whatever.
Well, physics is a counterexample, isn't it?
No, I mean, the funding for theoretical physics compared to empirical physics, I mean, look how much money they spend on CERN versus how much they spend on the theoreticians.
Well, there's a relative amount, but if you're a theoretical physicist, are you looked down upon and shunned?
If
I
you're
don't
a
think
string
so.
theorist, I think you are.
Well, here's an interesting in biology, we saw a phase shift happen here because in genetics, after there's been a real change after the genome project and all this stuff, that now there's the theoretical and mathematical components are sort of equal partners in genetics. That hasn't really happened yet in neuroscience, and experimentalists don't really care.
So the reason why you can tell we don't have the right data in neuroscience is very simple. So I was a theorist in neuroscience for a long time, And I would meet neuroscientists, and they would say, I'm right, but the other people just aren't smart enough to understand why I'm right. And so the thing is that in fact, many of the people who said that, I actually kind of agreed with them. They were brilliant people, and it's true that other people didn't recognize they were probably right. But science moves forward when the data is so clear that we know who's right. If it's another field like philosophy, then we have a lot of arguments. But the most successful areas in science, we have decisive experiments, and there's no argument. It just hands down, it's over.
Yeah.
And that's the era that we're trying to get to in neuroscience.
I don't think that doesn't imply we don't have the right data. That just implies that unlike in physics, where very often the problems in physics can be crystallized into a very few set of constraints, and it's going to be this way or that way. And in neuroscience, you have many, many constraints going on at the same time with a lot of probabilities on different ones. It's just a much harder problem. I don't think it argues for I think it's a fact.
So there's a difference. There's a certain similarity between string theory and theoretical neuroscience, because we have these theories that are around for decades without ever being tested. But there's a difference. In the case of string theory, the energy scales required, it's really impossible for us to test it. But in neuroscience, it's possible.
Yeah,
the scales are such that neurons, they're not incredibly small. They're small, they're intricate, but they are things. You can actually see neurons. I mean, you could see neurons with the naked eye.
Look, all I'm arguing is,
So
to say that we don't have enough data. I don't know how many thousands of papers have been written in the last couple of years about the properties of dendrites and neurons, and they're not people aren't paying attention to that. Theorists are not paying attention to that. They don't read that stuff. They don't understand it. They just, you see so many that talk to you, I don't really know.
So,
but
Jeff,
it's out there.
I've done this in the hippocampus. I did exactly what you're saying, where you read every single paper that's ever been published about one particular region. In my case, the dentate gyrus, and it's a small region, so you're able to do this. And I see a lot of value, and I think it was Sebastian's talk, where he said what we need for cell definitions is a molecular, an anatomical, and a physiological definition that are independently applicable to a cell, and they all agree. And having read through that literature, in the hippocampus at least, the definitions are completely inconsistent with each other.
I agree.
And so unless you have systematic data collection, as a bottom-up theorist, which is what I've done, which is what you're advocating, it's almost impossible. You can always justify whatever you do somewhere in the literature. So you have to have new data that's done with our modern tools in order to advance this.
I'm just saying, what I agree, what you find in the neuroscience literature is that the neuroscientists use different terms, they use different procedures, you have to understand all that. You can't read a single paper and make any assessment from it, you have to read dozens of them on a particular topic. I'll only claiming there's a lot of data there. It's hard to go through, it's very difficult. It was collected without a theoretical framework in mind, so people didn't really know. Often the detail you want to know from a particular scientist, they didn't write down because they just didn't know if that was important for anybody. But I'm going to stick to my point. There is a tremendous amount of unassimilated data. Maybe you haven't been able to assimilate it. Maybe we can't. But you can't deny that there are thousands of papers, unless you just want to say they're all wrong and useless, which I think is pretty dangerous to say. There is amazing amount of data out there that people aren't paying attention to. It is difficult, yes. It is very, very hard to go through, yes. But it's hard to deny that it exists.
So I want to pick up on this sort of self-loathing of theorists theme, and hopefully discuss something that we can all agree on, which is Steve Grossberg. Okay, so that'll keep it, out of keep us out of the mirror here. Anybody's tried to read one of Steve's papers, you immediately get the impression that there's something there, but you're really not sure what it is. And there's an incredible detail in the data, neuroscience data that's being discussed at multiple levels. It looks extremely compelling. The fits, the model reproduces the patterns of data, very accurately. And yet most people I talk to are like, well, I don't know, is that right? I just don't know, and it's the papers, they're complicated. And so, I think if you take, we can all agree, because Steve's not here, that that those are, that's like, okay, if I'm an empirical neuroscientist, I'm going to ignore that work because it's hard, it's complicated, and it's not obvious to me that I'm going to advance my career by reading those papers and trying to understand them. And I think if we
I
take
totally
that
agree
same
with
mirror,
that.
take the same mirror and apply it to any of our own work, and unfortunately, I think we're cast in the same light. And I think that's the real challenge, is it's really hard to make a obvious, nobody can ignore it kind of thing that Sebastian was talking about, just like an obvious point, like, okay, here's a real fact that if you didn't know this, your career would die
I
as an
totally
empirical
agree.
neuroscientist.
with
That's
you-
really hard.
I agree with your comments about Steve Grossberg. I do how difficult it is. I'm just pointing out, we have been collecting more and more data. I'm always for it. I love it. It's just... Yeah.
We have a question from the audience.
Well, I just wanted to give the panel a break and a pause for a moment. So two things. First of all, there is a enormous amount of data. Some of us go to the Neuroscience annual meeting. There's 8,500 abstracts, I think, and in any area that we've talked about, any aspect of the cortex or the thalamus or the retina, and its physiology, its anatomy, its molecular characteristics, there are scores of papers, and there have been every year, and that's what Jeff is referring to, and it's certainly true. Should point out, and Jacob's not here, so I can straightforwardly say that he's launched a program to do something about this. There is not data because the tools are very difficult. They haven't been on the table till just recently. At what he calls some people call the mesoscale, where you've got a circuit that you observe in concert with hundreds, thousands, perhaps 10,000 neurons. And you see the physiological activity, and you then later reconstruct the wiring, and then you put the pieces together of circuit function. A lot of the data is much more granular because the tools are only available. But the other thing so there's a new category of data that's needed that may be coming in the next 5 years. But the other thing that's really apparent is that this conference is all about a new paradigm in computing and how we can be informed by neural circuitry and inspiration from that. And what no one's really laid the groundwork for yet, certainly Jeff has been one of the few trying, is to take the elements of neural components, synapses, neurons, their growth, their modification, their homeostatic regulation, their wiring, and tackle integrating that into working systems. Not that hasn't been done. Certainly Randall's work is very impressive, but to take it to the next level where you embed many more neural mechanisms and then build a new paradigm, whether it's a neural machine learning or whether it's a highly functional computational neuroscience. There's really a next paradigm that I think the purpose of this meeting is to try to define, that I don't think we're really talking about yet.
I'm trying.
I agree not to disagree, right? To disagree. We must agree to disagree. I think that's important. So because of that, I'd like to follow up a question. If I ask all the distinguished panelists, if the theory is very important, what would be two major directions that may need to break through after many years of the theoretical exercise? Likewise, if experiments are so important, what are the critical experiments that we need to do?
I have a quarter of an answer to that, I guess. I mean, as I said in my talk, I think that the dividing line, let's say, between our current understanding of the brain and the next level might be at the level of variable binding. So I think for me, and I know not everybody will agree, for me there's a whole set of phenomena in higher level cognition and language and so forth that I think current theories don't give us any purchase on. And I think if we could lick that one, that we could get a lot of mileage. Oh, we got another answer.
Yeah. So I'll go on a more bottom-up perspective, but one of the things that I think is only beginning to be really talked about in the neuroscience field and isn't talked about much in the machine learning AI fields is kind of being in the dynamical regime, the computations being in the, more than just kind of static updatings of neural network models, but thinking about the cortex in particular as a dynamical system. And I think that ultimately that's where the breakthrough is going to come through, is actually what does it mean to do high-dimensional dynamical systems and computation in that domain. We've had, both Jeff and Randy kind of touched on that in their models, but I do think that's ultimately where the breakthroughs are going to come in computational neuroscience and then moving up into machine learning.
I would second that comment. Our models and our theory has a lot of predictions about the dynamics of cell firings and exactly under what conditions and so on. And it's very, very difficult to get that data because the way physiological experiments are done today under different conditions of the animal, it's sliced, in vitro, vivo, anesthetized, and so on. It's very, very complex to get the sort of right data that we want. But dynamical, if we could measure the firing of cells in some patch of cortex, even without knowing the connectivity, just knowing exactly under what conditions, how level of sparsity, how do certain activities move throughout that region of cortex, that would be extremely valuable to have. So I'm not an anti-data guy. I'd love to have that data, but that would be one thing I'd really love to see. Also, by the way, when we do connectome stuff, I'm fearful that we won't get the data we need to get. For me, it's really important not just two cells form a synapse between each other, but where on the dendritic tree they form that synapse. That's a critical component, and I'm hoping they're going to capture that and make that available very clearly when they collect that data. Because there are some techniques out there that won't tell you that.
I wanted to ask a question. There's always going to be plenty of money for studying how the brain works from a basic science perspective, from a humanity perspective, and understanding how different aspects of the brain lead to injury, disease, and things like that. But most of us in the room are engineers, come from an engineering community. And Dan said something this morning that is important. He said, this argument that we have an existence proof in the brain has sort of been carrying the funding of neuromorphic engineering community for, I think probably about 25 years, maybe 20 years. And I think that regime is likely coming to an end. And I think one of the reasons why it's coming to an end is that for the vast majority of that time, if you looked at the kinds of problems that people in the neuromorphic community thought that they could solve, which are largely sensory information processing problems, there weren't really any good alternatives, right? There was a whole bunch of machine learning approaches that, except in a few niche applications, didn't come anywhere near human performance and didn't do anything close to what we really wanted them to do. And just in the last few years, the advent of neural networks, deep neural networks and such, and other nonlinear techniques, seems like it's going to solve, at least from a practical perspective, a number of those problems that were traditionally held up by this community as the hard problems in engineering sensory perception. And so from someone who works at a funding organization who has the dual motivation of wanting to understand the brain but also wanting to be able to demonstrate some impact, some value on obtaining that understanding, I think it's really important that looking forwards we choose problems that we're likely to make some progress on that are not likely to be overcome by these engineering solutions that may or may not have anything to do with the brain, at least from the perspective of acquiring more interests and more funding. So I'm curious to know, there was some discussion this morning from some of the members of the panel, Gary, about language comprehension as a critical problem. We obviously, on the microns program, we set up some problems that I think were mentioned a number of times, one-shot learning and things like that. But I'd really like to know from your perspective, if you think, if you're proposing your research for what this understanding the brain is going to get us that neural networks or deep neural networks or some engineering solution isn't in the next 10 or 15 years, where do you set that target such that it's achievable, but only in neuroscience, or most likely in neuroscience?
I think the irony there, and Paul Rhodes and I had a discussion about this at Google a few months ago, I think the irony there is the things that people are best on are the ones we know the least about the neuroscience. So people are best at language, abstract planning systems and so forth, where you have to do some very complicated exercise in being imaginative and inventive. And the things we know most about neuroscience are these low-level sensory things that can be engineered. So I think it's a very interesting question, but filled with irony.
By the way, that's not an answer.
That's why I'm passing the mic.
Yeah, so my stab at that would be that combining the successes of, essentially neural processing that we've seen with neural networks, approaches to perception, combining that with control problems, and Dan highlighted that in his presentation, that you actually, on the one hand, you have all these kind of symbolic planning algorithms and, production systems and high-level symbolic architectures that can do various forms of reasoning and solve various kinds of complicated things like air traffic control and stuff like that. But if we are actually able to take a neural approach to those kinds of problems and incorporate the kind of robustness, abstraction, kind of dynamic processing abilities that we've been talking about that are characteristic of the neural architecture, and integrate that with those kinds of higher level sequencing and cognitive planning kinds of structures, that you'll get something, especially also including all the adaptive characteristics, so that it's a trainable, robust, innovative, creative, problem-solving system. I think those are the kinds of characteristics that nothing in AI currently exhibits, and would be very powerful and could arguably be, built on neural mechanisms.
Do you still want more answers to that question?
Okay. Yes, Jacob, I don't really understand the thinking behind that question, because isn't it the case that the success of simulated neural nets should mean boom times for hardware? Because those simulated neural nets are very naturally suited to implementation in hardware, except, of course, for the fact that they're trained by back propagation as opposed to some more biologically plausible algorithm, which would be...
Yeah, I want to make a comment in...
Okay, so I guess why wouldn't you think the success of simulated neural nets... Why wouldn't you think the success of simulated neural nets would just be an obvious boom for the hardware?
The question is, does it really need to be neuromorphic? I mean, so you can build a GPU simulation of a content.
Yeah, but for low power applications, for very large scale things, I mean, why not? It's not obvious to me. So maybe Jacob, you just...
It's almost like we've been down so long we've forgotten how far we are from what real humans are able to do. It's not just language. I mean, we're still talking about recognizing MNIST data sets and so on. It's ridiculous. We are so far from human level performance on so many things. This takes basic motor abilities in navigating a world. Discovering the structure, walking around, doing things. This is the most basic thing all animals do. And we aren't, just doing another image classification system is not even close to that. And so, if I were to pick one task, I would talk about sensory motor integration. We haven't even scratched the surface of that yet. But I would argue in the end what's going to win out for neural systems is its extreme flexibility. And I don't think you're going to find that in other methodologies. Maybe we could discover it without thinking about brains. We might have just been able to intuit it and just make it up. It might have just worked that way. Apparently it hasn't. Maybe it'll happen tomorrow. Maybe we're on the verge of that. But given the history we've had so far, I think we haven't really figured out how to make systems that are extremely flexible like our brains. And in the end, it's that flexibility that wins. That's why the digital computer won out over all other types of computational systems, some of which are much better at particular problems. But it's the flexibility of the digital computer which won out. And I think neural mechanisms aren't going to win out because of the flexibility. But if I had to pick one thing today, I would talk about sensory motor integration, sensory motor behavior. We are so far away from having anything which is as capable as a mosquito. Roomba. That's pretty low bar.
Yeah, Sebastian, I didn't mean to say that there's not a good market for hardware development. I meant to say more along the lines of developing neural systems, neural algorithms, somewhere above the level of just can you implement an efficient implementation, or can you build an efficient implementation of an existing algorithm. I totally agree. There's that's what the cortical processor program... I'm making a distinction between this sort of innovation. You know, when you're talking about engineering optimization, it's a different sort of class of problem than are you developing some fundamental new capability. New algorithms are a new application of existing algorithms. And you know, we talk a lot about, the field says things, you know, about like sensory motor integration, but I'll tell you that from like where I sit, so sensory motor integration is not, first of all, my forte, and apparently, and secondly, it's not a task, right?
Call it fluid robotics. How about that?
No, I understand, but it's not a task, right? It doesn't lend itself to a closed form solution. Here's the input, here's what the input should be, and here's what the output should look like under a whole class of conditions. It's something that we talk about that's sort of vague, and it's hard to describe, and it's hard to...
But would you settle for fluid robotics, you know, a system that can, you know, run upstairs and open a door and get a glass of water?
So I agree with Jeff actually here. I think that the neural net revolution hasn't hit robotics yet. And it's harder, right? Because it's harder because you can't do the whole thing in simulation, I think. So you can't just solve this with a huge amount of training data and backpropagation. I think this is an unsolved problem, and it's also commercially a big deal. If the current neural nets revolution somehow, you know, hit robotics, it could transform that industry.
And I want to pile on with Jeff and Sebastian and in a way and say that the problem with setting everything up as a closed form task is you're missing the flexibility that Jeff is talking about. So the closest thing that I know about is the DARPA robotics program right now with the, you know, the Fukushima scenario. And if they really did that full on without like playing games with the bit rates and stuff like that so that you can still kind of teleoperate, that would actually be a really good challenge. I mean, then it would be a much more flexible, open-ended challenge, and maybe that would be a place where you would see advantage for a neuromorphic system as opposed to a classical AI system that's very limited, as opposed to a deep net that is pretty limited to particular tasks and so forth.
At least I'm arguing you should study how brains solve that problem, and it might inform you. Because that's basically the problem. I argued in my talk today, that is basically the problem that brains solve, the sensory motor integration, and it's not classification.
Goal-oriented behavior.
Yeah, if you want to call it that, call it that.
That's a while ago now, but I want to come back to Jacob's argument where he says that the argument for neuromorphic computing has disappeared because of the advent of neural networks. I mean, that's a bit extreme, I think, because neural networks have been there for quite a while, in fact, since the 50s or 60s. I mean, the reason that these neural networks are so successful now is that we have computers that are able to train them. So it's
and
the
data sets
existence
big enough.
and data sets big enough which can be handled by these computers. So it's really the high performance computers or even the normal laptops, which by now are high performance computers, that have enabled this kind of revolution. But of course we know that these computer architectures that we use for training neural networks and also for handling the data are not really optimized for that in terms of their architecture. And in fact, I think this is the spot where new computer architectures like neuromorphic architectures have their main reason of existence, which is the training and the learning and the developmental aspects of neural networks. This is what massively parallel hardware architectures can, in principle and also in practice by now, I think, do better than conventional computers. And this is what we should all work on.
We do now have the true north problem, right? You have this brilliant chip, it's really interesting,
Yeah, but
and nobody knows what to do with it.
Exactly, that is what it cannot do, is it doesn't have effective ways of implementing learning, development, and
But so Jacob's question is, in some ways, is so True North didn't really give the leverage. What are the domains in which neuromorphic might really give some leverage? You know, neuromorphic done better might give some leverage you don't get anywhere else, right? That's essentially your question.
You know, I wonder how many people, you know, I'm old enough to actually have been doing what I'm doing now in the early 80s. At least I was trying to do what I'm doing now. And I remember very explicitly the whole neural network revolution that happened around that time. The PDP books, you know, the whole backpropagation stuff, companies were formed. It was just like today. If you're old enough like me, do you remember that? It was just like today. There was just as much excitement, just as much talk about it, just as many companies going into it, just as many people building hardware for it back in the mid-'80s.
in early 90s. And what happened, it just didn't go far enough. They got stuck in a local minima, and I'm afraid we're doing that again right now with deep learning. We are basically saying, oh, this is cool, we've solved some problems, blah, 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 the world's going crazy, and then it's just going to sit around for a few years, and we're not really going to solve the hard problems. It seems just my pattern recognition is kicking in, and I've seen this play before. It's a fun play to watch, but you know, it doesn't have a happy ending. And does anyone else feel that way?
I mean, just one counterpoint. I think there's many more actual real live applications of the technology that people are actually using on their cell phones,
you know what? It
on a
said,
daily basis.
That's what it felt like back then.
There wasn't the applications. There simply
People were,
weren't.
oh,
There were
you
no
kidding me?
applications.
People were using it. It was every company in the world that says we've employed neural networks to solve this problem, this problem, this problem. They were doing that. It was everywhere. It just didn't go beyond that. It just wasn't good enough. Now, maybe it is good enough now. I don't know, but it sure smelled, I mean, I'm telling you, it felt like that back then.
As somebody who was in both revolutions, I would say that, yeah, I mean, I doubt that the deep nets are solving everything. You know, I was saying plenty of visual tasks, plenty of things that humans can do that machines can't. But I would have to say they've gone a long way further than they had in the 1980s. You know, people were talking about deep, you know, networks being used in things. You know, vacuum cleaners were talking about having fuzzy logic, but basically a lot of it was pure hype in those days. Now it isn't just hype.
Look on the bright side, Jeff. The youngsters are working on neural networks. At least they're not working on support vector machines.
They're coming back on top of neural networks. I can give you papers.
The problem is exactly what Jacob was talking about. You know, they're working on it, but most of them will, you know, will they get beyond that? Will they say, we're not satisfied with this? Will they say, no, we have to do much, much more? Will funding dry up for other types of activities? That's what happened in the mid-'80s to the early '90s. And I swear everything is the same right this time out. It might be to come out differently. But anyway, there is a risk to this, that you have another generation who was brought up on excitement, they build this stuff, and in the end, it's not going to be as big as everyone thinks it is right now, and it's not going to be as pervasive, and it's not going to solve all those problems that we really like to solve, like building really intelligent machines that are fantastic, not just, you know, okay, looking at detecting cats or dogs or whatever, but really fantastic. Amazing capabilities that we should be able to do, things that are smarter than humans and faster and distributed and incredible stuff. We're just so far from that that I'm just totally disappointed where we are. I'm not being critical, I can't be happy.
Paraphrasing Peter Thiel, we wanted Rosie the robot, and what we've got is Roomba.
Well, I have to say I'm happy. But no. I mean, I think it's you know, everything is going forward incrementally, piece by piece. And I think it's amazing what you can do with some of the deep networks in conjunction with other things. I think if you talk to people who are doing computer vision, they would say, you know, one of the aspects that's come out of vision in the last 10 years was using features. Features were hand designed, they were messy, they were ugly, and so on. And you just take any method that had those features and you replace it by a deep network and you get huge jumps in performance. Yeah. Does that mean we've solved it? No, I do not think we've solved it. But I do think that it's got a lot of really useful practical applications.
Yeah, but like, just to take Jeff's side for a second, let's look at Google's cat detector. Google's cat detector, which was on the front page of the New York Times as, you know, a wonderful revolutionary thing. And it's already been shelved. They don't even use it anymore. Everybody's like, unsupervised learning this, unsupervised learning that, and then it's gone.
I tend not to believe anything I read in the New York Times in terms of science.
There was another front page article about deep learning. There was that.
Well, there were one about text captioning. And we know that worked because we'd actually done work on that, which was actually better. But because we've done it, I also know its limitations, and there are many limitations of it. In a way, it's amazing how well it does, considering what it's trying to do and what its inputs are. But it's a hell of a long way away from doing any real text
Are we really disagreeing here? So I think we all think that deep learning has lots of limits, and anyone who's paying attention realizes it's used in production now. So it's used.
I'll make a statement here. Nobody today is working on vision. They're working on image classification.
Agreed.
Vision is what I'm doing when I'm walking around right now and my eyes are moving all over the place and I'm picking this thing up over here without even looking at it. That is vision, right? We are doing image classification. Now that's useful, that's great, but let's not fool ourselves that we are doing vision. It's nothing close to what animals do. All animals, from mice to human, are doing with vision. We're just not even beginning to scratch the surface on that.
I have to disagree somewhat on that. No, I mean, certainly moving around and getting insight from it, but if you take a single image, if you could take a similar image and you could pass it and find the positions of everyone in the image and all the, and all the actions and things they're doing, that would go a very long way to doing vision, and doing action recognition would just be take it a little bit further.
We do not process images. Humans process a visual data stream which is constantly changing.
You'd love my colleague Stefano Suato. I have many happy arguments about the same thing with him.
It's a fact. I mean, it's a fact that that's what brains do. Maybe you could argue that it's not important.
No, I'm not arguing it's not important. I'm arguing there were different ways of getting at it. And I think interpreting individual images, just to give it a justification of it, if you can get really rich descriptions out from that, then getting them out from sequence of images is just, getting them out from one image, one after the other.
I guess we'll have to disagree about that. I mean, that's the old idea is that one of the things that people study about image classification is that they can take out the time out of vision, right? Because real vision is a time-based process. And they say, well, that's too messy. I know I can do a spatial classification, like what we call a flash inference. So let's just solve that problem. But that is so small compared to what real vision is. And you can argue maybe it's not important, but I think there's nothing wrong with doing that, but we've thrown away 99% of what vision is.
Well, no, I would just, if you're just taking ImageNet classification, I agree. No, image parsing. To tell you, if I could give you a system that would give you the position of everybody in the image, I think that would go a very long way to solving vision. And I think doing it over a sequence of images, would be a question of time. One reason people haven't done it in vision, well, anyway, let me not get onto that issue there.
But I think you have to agree with Jeff that most of the work in vision right now is directed towards classification in ImageNet. That's the popular stuff.
I agree, and I think that's unfortunate. And in the computer vision community, there's a tendency to rush towards data sets with big challenges, and that's why everyone's rushing into that.
That's what Jeff and I are railing against.
Okay, well, that's great. Talk to my graduate students. I have to keep on telling them, don't do that. Okay, everybody else is doing it.
That's a problem
Let's
with the
move
field.
away from
Jump
that.
in here.
No, it's a problem with the field. I agree.
Let me jump in here.
But I can give you lots of examples of vision which is just not doing that.
First, a quick piece of background. I am or was in the computer vision community in the 2000s. Two thoughts for you. One, maybe the still image problem can't be solved until you solve the moving image problem.
Yes, you're right.
And
no, you're not.
And the other, which is kind of a bigger statement than that, is what if we can't solve either of those problems until we solve AI in general? What if it's an AI complete problem in the sense
I don't like being in the majority.
In order to make sense of a scene, you have to understand a lot of things about the world. It's a much broader AI problem than simply processing an image.
Oh, my turn.
Also, the computer vision activities I'm aware of are doing real-time video vision recognition. Andrew Davison at Imperial runs real-time robotic vision systems, and some of that's about to emerge in a new commercial vacuum cleaner. The Dyson uses real-time 360-degree vision to find its way around the place. Now, it's not vision at the level of capability of a mouse or a small animal, but it is real-time.
Well, you can do a lot of things real time, and you can take video and turn it into a series of images, and you can process it and so on. But to the gentleman...
But they don't take it, it's not a series of images. It's basically constructing, it's a SLAM system that constructs...
Yeah, the SLAM is...
A Bayesian network.
Yes,
very
okay, so maybe it's a good way, maybe a good start.
Yeah.
But the previous gentleman's comment about, true AI, I think we should, try to avoid that question. But I think you're right. I think, for us, the way, I understand it I have a pretty good understanding how we do this. The way we learn to see is by movement. And the way we learn to see, and the way we build a model of the world is by movement. This is very obvious if you think about other sensory modalities. If you think about touch, or you think about or audition. Take Helen Keller. right? This woman had no sight and no hearing, and she built the same model of the world that you and I build. She knew the same world. She knows the same objects and how they work. She learned language. She built the model of the world without any kind of spatial classification going on. And that's how brains work. It's a sort of a fluke of statistics of vision that we can do these sort of image classification things. But all the other central modalities are time-based, exploratory through time. And vision's no different than that. And I think we have to solve that, whether you want to call that big AI or whatever. I think we have to solve that. That's my point to Jacob earlier. We have to solve the entire sensory-motor integration system to really solve vision.
I just wanted to toss one little bomb out there about solving the whole AI problem, and that is perhaps the Fukushima test could be the replacement for the Turing test.
Yeah, I'd like to make a point.
Can I speak to that for a second? Can I? I just want to bring an empirical fact to the audience's attention since you brought that up. Fei Li and I are trying to put together a challenge as part of this revised Turing test where you see either an image or a video and things like that, and then you answer like journalist questions basically about what's going on. So that will be part of a revised Turing test, which we hope will premiere in February 2016 at the next AAAI.
Yeah, maybe I can help to make Jeff's case here. Is that a lot of people in this room should be familiar with those gondola-driven kittens? How many people heard about that experiment? It's very famous, really. They raised the kittens in complete. Oh, I'm gonna make Jeff's point about the vision without embodiment is not possible. And the empirical fact, which they don't exist by the way, but let's say that there's an empirical research that the researcher raised the little kittens in the darkness. And at some point, they put them into the lit room where one group of kitten was actually navigating under their own power, and the other group was driven by gondolas in some kind of mirror fashion connected to the active kittens. And after 3 weeks of this, it turned out that the gondola-driven kittens were functionally blind. They couldn't stand, they couldn't walk, they would get off the cliff, they would not open their paws when they were lowered to the grounds, they were functionally blind. And that's the fundamental difference between AI and neuroscience, because the whole fact about AI is disembodied. And that's why it will never work.
I don't believe...
Yeah, but they will never embody AI, because the very essence of AI is that mind and body are separate.
There's several results from that era that are not fully replicable, and I'm going to bet that this is one of them. You have to remember that people with SMA are confined to wheelchairs, can't move, and still learn about the world, sort of like Jeff's point about Helen Keller.
They can move their eyes. Look, let's not say that AI is all about disembodiment. I use the term machine intelligence. I prefer that. But that was the main point I talked about today, is that is the problem you have to solve. It's machine intelligence is about embodiment. It's about sensory motor integration. And so to say that AI, if you define AI as intelligence without a body, then I guess that'll never happen. But we got to come up with something else. When we can build machines that have embodiments, then that's what we should be shooting for. I'm just pointing out, my argument is that I thought you were agreeing with me, but maybe not, I don't know. Is that
That's not the criterion.
You know, the way humans learn, the way the neocortex learns is through behavior. Now, whether that's important in an industry or for hardware, I don't know. But that's the way we learn, that's the way all mammals learn in their neocortex, and regardless of what you think about it, that's what I'm going to build, okay? So that's what we're doing. And, you know, but that's a fact. I think it's a fact. Even I agree. Okay. We'll just debate about how useful that is. I think it's so mind-numbingly obvious to me. I'm sorry to say that, but it seems so obvious to me that I can't believe we debate that.
So maybe just to wrap up the panel discussion again, and maybe a preview for tomorrow. So tomorrow is going to be a little bit more towards hardware. and maybe trying to tie discussion today to sort of what can we build and what can we use those systems for. Hopefully we'll be able to get into that discussion with a little bit more depth tomorrow as well. So let's go ahead and give the panelists and the speakers a hand.